Is this thing even on? I think it's time we talk T-Max. All right, so today's film is a little bit different. It looks like my HDMI cable between the X-T4 and the Atomos Ninja is not working well. I'm getting a little lost signal message here, but hey, maybe that's part of the flavor of this film. I don't know. Who am I to hold back this equipment? I don't know. So today's a little bit different. I was gonna get up and do another Q&A film, another film sort of in line with what I've been doing in the past, but then I was realizing that I hadn't done anything about film in quite some time. And I thought it would be interesting to do a little take on film, T-Max family of films in particular. I have a whole slew of points here that I want to get through. But one of the things that to me, when I think about film, it's not just about the material, it's not just about the look of film, it's not just about the abilities that film gives you when you're using it and after you're using it. It's actually about the simplicity of what I use when I'm using film. And so for me to think about going into the field with one of these, which, if you don't know, is filled with film, or even a smaller one, 5 rolls of film, which, you know, depending on what I'm doing could last all day or could last 5 minutes. But the idea of just taking this camera and this is incredibly liberating. This is a Leica M4, for those of you who don't know, German, black paint, first batch M4, probably my all-time favorite Leica. I've had a lot of other Leicas in the past, primarily M6s, but the M4 is definitely my favorite. But I like this camera because there are no electronics in this camera at all. When you look through, there's nothing that lights up. It's just a box. It's a brass box. It's incredibly simple. It's small, it's light, it's reliable. And then you shove this in your pocket. Even if you were wearing a mesh thong Speedo, you could still carry, maybe not this, you could still carry this. Just slip it in the side. And that's all you would have to carry. That's incredibly liberating because for me now when I go in the field, it's a bit of a fire drill. I'm carrying an X-T4 with the booster and all the lenses, 2 X-T2s, a Sony ZV-1, a GoPro, 2 audio recorders, a drone. It's a mess. It looks like a yard sale every time I go into the field. So when I talk about film, this is one of the things I really like about it is you don't need anything else. Now it's limiting in the sense that you can't see the images, you're not gonna get anything immediate, etc. All the things that people say about film are limitations. I actually think that they're benefits of using it. It's nice to not have unlimited firepower. It's nice to not be able to see what you're doing. It's nice to not have immediacy. All those things that we, I don't know, have sort of built into our lives these days. Kind of nice to go the other way. I want to talk about T-Max in particular, and I want to talk about T-Max films, and then I'm going to primarily focus on T-Max 3200 because that is the film that I shot the most of. Although there is a sleeper film out there, and I'm not sure how many people know about it that I want to make sure you know is out there in case you are a lover of film. So the T-Max family of films and the difference between when T-Max came along and the other traditional black and white films from Kodak, which would have been the Plus X, the Tri-X primarily, and if you go far enough back, you have things like Panatomic X, which were basically gone by the time I came into photography. I knew photographers who had built basically their entire career on Panatomic X and then it went away. And so you basically, when I came up, you had Plus X, Tri-X, and you had the Ilford films, and you had Fuji black and white, but nobody shot Fuji black and white, which is sad because it was a great film. One of the best black and white films I think that was out there, but it just didn't really get a lot of exposure. Tri-X was by far the most dominant black and white film of my entire lifetime. It has been the most dominant film of the modern era in terms of black and white film. If you looked at a famous photograph in the modern era that was shot on black and white film, and if you said to yourself, I think I'll just guess Tri-X, in most cases you're going to be on the money. Ilford also made good films. They were probably the second most popular film that I saw during the entire time that I was shooting film. But T-Max came along with T-Grain, and T-Grain was way sharper and way finer grain than anything that Kodak had prior, at least in the Plus X Tri-X family. But like all things digital and all things modern, just because it had tighter grain and smoother grain didn't make it a better film than Tri-X or Plus X. It was just different. And learning a film is like learning a language. You can spend an entire lifetime with it and never get that good with it. You can never fully understand all of the aspects that that film can give you and all the looks that that film can give you. So Tri-X, in my opinion, was like the Chevy 350 of films. It was bulletproof. You could, let's say that you wanted to make pozole and you were processing film right before you were going to make pozole. And then you got into making your pozole and you forgot that your Tri-X was in the developer. Well, you could go back to your Tri-X after making and then eating your pozole, and your Tri-X conceivably could still be fine. You could still have a usable negative that you could print in the darkroom. T-Max films were not this way. T-Max films were finicky. You do not want to overexpose or you do not want to overprocess T-Max films or the combination of the two, because what happens is the negative blocks up. And when I say block up, I mean the highlight areas get so dense you cannot force light through them in an enlarger, and you cannot make prints. Scratch that. You can make prints, but they're horrible. Now, Tri-X will be forgiving. It's really hard to block Tri-X up, but T-Max was really finicky. If processed well, if exposed well, you could get beautiful prints, razor sharp grain, but you had to be careful. Let's focus now, and I'll come back to T-Max 400 in a minute, but I want to talk about T-Max 3200. T-Max 3200, P3200, P as in Paul, 3200 T-Max is the film that I spent the most amount of time with in the T-Max family. I don't know why exactly I fell in love with this film, but I did immediately. And for about a 10-year period, probably the most active 10-year period of my entire career, that was my exclusive film. I shot T-Max 3200 all the time. Rain, snow, sun. It didn't matter if it was 12 noon or 12 midnight. I figured out ways of shooting this film. What I loved about T-Max 3200 was the grain. I could not get enough grain. And the lab owner in LA that I was using at the time said to me, he goes, Milner, everybody comes in here and they're trying to reduce their grain. They're trying to get smoother images. And you come in here and you're going the opposite way. You're trying to accentuate all the grain that you have. So T-Max 3200, let's talk a little bit about the tech specs of this film. This is not a 3200 speed film. So I did a film about film on YouTube, I don't know, 6 months ago, 8 months ago. And one of the things I mentioned was effective film speed versus film speed on the box. Very rarely do you have a film that is advertised as a 400, an 800, a 16, a 100, a 50 that is an actual true speed to that film. The box is misleading. Every film is a little different, and when you throw in the combination of developers and papers and agitation and temperature, then that film speed has even less relevance than what it says on the box. Can you buy a film and shoot it at the speed on the box? Yes, you can. Will you get the most of that film? Typically, no. And this is where the great experimentation begins. And I mentioned this a minute ago. You can use a film for your whole life. You can speak a language for your whole life and never fully utilize all that it has to offer. And I think that is true. The effective film speed of TMZ is 1250. Now, you're going to get people that are going to argue with me about every single thing I say on here. Some people think it's a 2000 true speed film. I think, and I worked for Kodak for 4 years, Kodak Professional, it's a 1250 film. It is a film designed to be push processed, meaning you rate it at one speed and then you over process it to bring it up to that speed. So for me, I would shoot T-Max 3200 anywhere between 800, which would require pulling the processing or under processing it. And that would really bring the grain in the film down and smooth it out. Now, I did that probably less frequently than anything else I'm about to tell you. Very rarely did I shoot it at 800. If I needed to go up a stop, I might push Tri-X to 6400 or 640 and go up a stop on Tri-X. But most of the time with TMZ, I was shooting it from 1600 to 6400. That required testing. And let me tell you a little bit about the testing here. Testing not only means what you're rating the film at, then you have to start figuring out who's processing it. Are you processing it yourself, or are you taking it to a lab? What lab are you taking it to? What is their line? Do they run a hot line or do they run a cold line? Are they running it by hand? Are they running it in a processor? If it's a processor, is it a dip and dunk? Is it a roller machine? All these will have impacts on what your processing is like. And then what kind of developer are they using? So let me get to developers in a minute, because that's a whole nother language. So 800 to 6400 typically is the range at which I'm using this film. Most of the time when I was doing this film, I was not processing it myself because I was working too much. I didn't have time to process and scan film. I would take it to a lab. the lab would process it, and then I would have it either scan it myself, or towards the end of my working career, I was having the lab do the scanning. And so I was trying to save on push processing fees. So if I wanted to shoot this film at 3200, it meant I had to pay for push processing. So I was often shooting it at 1250 or shooting it at 1600 and rating it normal so that I could have it processed normally and not blow all my money on extra push charges at the lab. If you're doing it yourself, obviously you can do whatever you want. You can push it to 12,000 if you want and spend an hour in the developer, it doesn't matter. So that's kind of what I was doing. One of the questions, or frequent questions I get about using TMZ, is how did you use TMZ in the middle of the day if it's bright sun out? And one of the ways that I did that is I used yellow filters on the lenses. And I had filters, I think they were B+W filters or heliopan filters. I don't remember. I don't have them anymore, I don't think. I should, but I don't. And they blocked about a stop to a stop and a half of light, which at times was just enough to make it doable and usable. The other response that I have to that question is, I don't often shoot in the middle of the day if the light is horrible, unless I have no other choice. To me, and I've mentioned this many times before, light, timing, and composition are the three main ingredients for photography, and light is first for a reason. I don't go out at 12 noon and bang out pictures thinking I'm gonna make something great, because oftentimes the light is the primary driving factor for when I'm gonna be out making pictures. And so early morning, that high speed is a really nice advantage. Late afternoon, it's a nice advantage. And if it's cloudy out, it's heavenly, and those yellow filters add a little bit of contrast as well. You could go up and use red filters, which are going to block even more, or orange or green or whatever, but then it starts to block too much, and it also starts to get too contrasty. I would rather add contrast in the printing process than have a negative that is so inherently contrasty, I'm kind of boxed in as to what I can do with it. So I mentioned this before, do not overprocess this film. You will be miserable, especially if you're printing in the darkroom. So let's talk a little bit about processing this film. Again, this is one of the awesome things about film in a wet darkroom. You can work, and I am not a great wet darkroom person. I spent a lot of time in the wet darkroom and I never got great at it. I have friends who are truly great in the wet darkroom, and when you see them work and you see the range of your abilities, you start to understand the concept of something like mastery. Mastery here is very rare, and mastery in modern photography is incredibly rare. People are moving way too quickly. And I have friends who are master analog printers and master digital printers, master retouchers, and when you see them work, you realize the levels of competency are dramatic. And so I was never that good. I could do kind of what I needed and wanted to do, but I had this whole other range of needs and wants in the darkrooms that I was never able to get, just because I didn't spend enough time. You know, I was too selfish doing other things, like, you know, going to the tractor pull, darkroom, tractor pull, darkroom. I don't know, it's a hard decision for me. It may not be for you. Developers. When I came into photography, the developer of choice globally was called D76. And this was the quintessential black and white powder developer from Kodak. There's nothing wrong with D76 other than it's not super environmentally friendly. D76 was fine. That's what the school had in the darkrooms. That's what every darkroom I ever went to had, D76. It was dirt cheap, super reliable. Again, it was the 10W30 motor oil. It worked for everything. The problem with D76 was, to me, it didn't give any specific look, and you had to mix it at high temperature. You had to have hot water to mix it. And that to me was kind of a nightmare. It slowed me down a little bit. I didn't like doing it. I didn't like the powder, because when you poured it in, the fumes from the powder went up. The darkroom's horrible for you anyway. Breathing fumes from D76, probably not so good. So along came a developer called Xtol, and Xtol was really designed for films like the T-Max family. And Xtol was good. A lot of labs dropped D76 and started to use Xtol. It was more environmentally friendly. It was a more adaptive developer. But again, it was kind of middle of the road. It wasn't a sexy developer. People didn't come out and say, oh, I'm gonna go use that lab because they use Xtol. It just was kind of like, yeah, it works, it's universal, you can throw anything in it and it'll process, but it's not sexy. Then you had to go back a little bit. If you went back a little bit, you could find developers like HC110, another Kodak developer. HC110 was really cool, and one of the reasons, this might sound crazy, but it's absolutely valid, one of the reasons I loved HC110, which came in a very thick liquid. It came in these jars about this big, and the amount of HC110 that you could put in a bottle cap from the bottle of HC110 was the perfect amount for either a 2-roll or 4-roll tank. I can't remember which, if it was 2 rolls or 4 rolls. But all you had to do is take the HC110 and you dumped it, you filled the bottle cap, and then the rest was water, and that was the perfect ratio of developer for either a 2-roll or 4-roll tank. Most of the time, I had single-roll tanks, I had 2-roll and 4-roll. I didn't like to process any of the giant, larger tanks because then you had to add compensation on top of it. And typically, sometimes I would roll 2 4-roll tanks. The HC110, wow. The Atomos Ninja eats batteries like candy, and the batteries are this big and they're this wide and thick, and bam, it just goes through. So I'm rambling. Clearly I'm rambling. I just ate an entire battery. So HC110, bottle cap, fills up, easy processor. Now, here's where we get interesting. There's also a developer called Rodinal. And Rodinal is a beautiful developer, but it's like a thoroughbred racehorse. It's a little high powered, a little bit goes a long way. The beauty of Rodinal is that Rodinal is an incredibly sharp developer that accentuates the grain. So Tri-X in Rodinal historically is one of my all-time favorite looks. My buddy Eric, documentary photographer out of San Diego at the time, Eric and I would go to Tijuana and shoot in Mexico together, and Eric's work had a darkroom in San Diego. He would use Tri-X and Rodinal, and it was absolutely gorgeous. Tri-X in Rodinal and TMZ is a fine line of too much grain or the perfect amounts, but it's a developer that if you don't know, you should explore. And to get really creative here, and by the way, there are 10 million other developers. The last developers I used and the last set of chemistry that I used in the darkroom myself personally is from a company called Sprint Systems, which I believe is in Massachusetts. And I love their chemistry, and it's also a little more environmentally friendly than some of these others. But you can get so down the rabbit hole in the darkroom with developing, and we're talking about high temperatures, high agitation, down to stand development, which is basically no agitation and letting your film sit in the developer forever. You can also develop film in straight Dectal. Dectal is a paper developer. This is harsh. This is like washing your car with sandpaper. It's really harsh. The rumor was back in the day in the newspaper world, photographers on deadline would process film in straight Dectal, and you could process a roll of film in like 45 seconds or some crazy thing. I never really did that. But again, these are the sort of developers. Me personally, for T-Max 3200, I would look at Xtal, I would look at HC110, and I would look at Rodinal just for fun. And again, a lot of other. And Sprint Systems, if you just want an overall complete system of chemistry for this film, Sprint works really well. Let's talk about scanning, and we got 2 or 3 more points here about TMZ. TMZ, for me, is an incredibly difficult film to print in the darkroom. It's incredibly hard. Now, I'm about to show you a box of darkroom prints, fiber from my project in Sicily. These were all printed in the darkroom. These are all printed on double weight fiber paper, double fixer bath. Some of these are selenium toned. That's another process that I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on, but toxic, but looks beautiful. Scanning TMZ and printing it digitally, to me, is the better way of using this film. Believe it or not. Tri-X I much prefer in the darkroom. I think making prints in the darkroom with Tri-X is completely doable, very easy. TMZ requires a very skillful darkroom operator. You have got to have your optics in the darkroom nailed. You want edge-to-edge sharpness on your easel. You want great optics in the enlarger. You want your chemistry, your processing, your timing, temperatures, everything needs to be right. This box of prints from Sicily took me forever to make these prints. I had this grand illusion that I was going to do editions of this Sicily work with 1114 darkroom prints. And I realized very quickly after spending weeks and weeks in the darkroom that it would take me years to get this whole edition done. If you imagine, let's say 40 images, 40 selects, and then doing editions of 5 or editions of 10, it would have literally taken me, I think, years to accomplish this in the darkroom, and I just realized it wasn't going to happen. Secondarily, I realized that my scanned TMZ printed digitally, I actually liked more than the darkroom prints. I think you can accentuate the grain digitally in ways that is very difficult in the darkroom. So that's what I have to say about scanning this stuff. But let's talk about printing this, and let's talk about this and printing in books. So if you're going to attempt this in the darkroom, and even if you're going to attempt Tri-X in the darkroom, split filter printing is essential. It's mandatory. And if you don't know what split filter printing is, it means that you're going to make 2 exposures on a single piece of paper using 2 different filters. One from the high end of the spectrum and one from the low end of the spectrum. If your overall exposure time is, and this is crude, by the way, if your overall exposure time is 20 seconds, you're going to do 10 seconds with one filter and 10 seconds with another. One's going to print for the highlight, one's going to print for the shadow. That's like essential with TMZ. With Tri-X, it isn't, but it also can really help and add a level of range to your prints that you may not get with a single filter. So let's talk a little about books and TMZ. So I have got a slew of things to show you. This film looks beautiful printed, especially small before the grain starts to blow apart. Once you get up to, with a darkroom print, I was never able to print TMZ beyond really 1620 without it falling apart. Digitally, you can print it the size of a wall, especially if you're using like digital silver out of the East Coast, which can use a light jet or a lambda to print with a red laser onto traditional photographic paper. Those prints are incredible. Then you can go as big as you want. When I first started making print-on-demand publications with TMZ, this was back in 2005, 2006, digital printers like HB Indigos really hadn't seen a lot of TMZ, and the printers would often confuse the grain of the film for noise, and they would put these black dot patterns over imagery. And I would have to reach out to the companies and say, look, this is not an undersized file, this is not a low-resolution file, this is a piece of film. And they would have to make adjustments, and then it would print beautifully. So even the books that I was doing in 2005 or 6 were printing beautifully, and I knew I could really continue to use this once my life became much more about making books. I mentioned the Sicily project. I have a book right here, which is an 8x10 softcover. It's not a particularly good book. However, the one thing about it that I think is incredibly relevant for what we're talking about today is the whole thing was shot. This entire project was shot on Kodak T-Max 3200. And if you look through at some of these images, you can see the range of rating that I'm using. You can see images that are more grainy than others, some that are a little smoother, but basically that entire project was shot on TMZ. One of the bad aspects of this film, and do not let TSA tell you anything otherwise, is this film with repeated exposure to airport x-rays, even the internal x-rays, will base fog. And TSA doesn't have any idea what they're talking about. They always lie about film exposure. It's basically, they're not malicious, they just don't know. This film will base fog. And what happens is you have a really hard time getting a black. The film takes on this weird sort of silvery sheen, and your blacks are no longer black. And so it's something you really have to be careful of. You have to use lead bags, and you basically beg for a hand inspection. You take all your film out of these boxes, you put it in something like this that opens very easily. You go early, you're polite, you say, I'm in no rush, this is what I'm doing, this is not a hobby for me, this is something more, this is my film, take your time, do whatever you need, I just don't want it x-rayed. And you have to be prepared for them to say, you're not getting on the plane if you don't x-ray your film. That still happens. Also, my magazine series, Essay, the first issue is filled with T-Max 3200. There's a couple of images in here that I think are wonderful illustrations of this film. There is a picture of two people at the edge of the Grand Canyon that are wearing leather cycling motorcycle chaps and Harley Davidson jackets, and the texture of this image and the texture, this is why I shoot TMZ. There is nothing like it. The Ilford high-speed black and white film is a great film. The problem for me was that there was not enough grain. It's too fine-grained. Here's another image from the edge of the Grand Canyon with a single person. It's the same image that's on the cover, but it's horizontal run double truck, and there's a single image here, and the texture of the canyon. This is why I use the film. And lastly, I also make journals. This one is called Notes, which is a companion book to my essay series. And this one is titled Let It Come Down. And for those of you who know Paul Bowles, the author and musician, you will know that that is a nod, a tip of my hat to Mr. Bowles, who I think was one of the best writers slash composers I've ever seen in my life. And he lived a life that was very commendable to me, very interesting, a pioneer in a lot of ways. So this notebook has lined and grid pages here for me to write on, but this is also another image, for example, that was shot with TMZ. This is from a project called Man vs. Nature that I worked on for 10 years. This is from El Mirage Dry Lake in California. So let me recap. Did I mention I like TMZ, that I enjoy shooting this film, that it's probably, I can't say it's my favorite black and white film because you cannot beat Tri-X. Tri-X is, if I had the desert island thing, If I'd take my Pozole to the desert island, and I would probably take, I don't know, it would be a death match between Tri-X and TMZ. I would have to put them in the MMA, in the cage, and they would duke it out, and whoever won would go to the island. It's hard to go wrong. Towards the latter part, towards the end of my career, I was using more Tri-X than TMZ, only because I was doing more commercial work with film when everyone had gone digital. And everyone said, oh, if you don't go digital, you're gonna go out of business. And I said, no, I don't think so. I think clients actually like film. They miss it. I went back, everybody else went the other way. And I was using a lot of Tri-X. And again, Tri-X I was rating at 320, 400, 640, occasionally 800, but typically no higher than 640, and using a range of developers, whatever. But this film, I don't wanna get off track. This film is about this simple little thing called P3200. This is magic, people. If you haven't used it, try it. You're gonna love it. Let me recap here just in case. Super fine T grains, very finicky in comparison to other films. True rating 1250, keep that in mind. Usable rating 800 to 64. You can go higher, but it's really gonna blow apart. If you need to block light, try yellow filters, orange filter, or even neutral densities if you wanna go that route. Do not overprocess, overexposure. Developers, D76, Xtol, HC110, Rodinol, and then if you want to get crazy, try straight Dectol. Try coffee, try, I don't know, citric acid, whatever you want to process in. This film scans beautifully and prints beautifully digitally. Darkroom printing, make sure your optics are right, make sure everything in your system is spot on, edge to edge sharpness, otherwise it's not going to look right. It's very difficult and finicky to print. I think you're better off printing digitally. And if you're gonna make books with it, it looks grand. It looks absolutely fantastic. So that's TMZ. That's my latest film about film for you film heads out there, you film junkies. I have to tip my hat to the analog world because you are rabid about photography, and it's one of the things that's keeping a lot of products alive is the consumer and prosumer world of rabid analog enthusiasts. So keep doing what you're doing, because otherwise these products are going to continue to fall. They're going to continue to go up in price. They probably will anyway, but you can tenaciously cling to them for as long as possible, because photography is better off when we have as many options as possible. And so film is super solid. It works. It looks great. It's different. Try it if you haven't done it. And if you're still doing it, keep doing it. And I will talk to you again.